This guy was a literary genius and a comedian. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. Delicious. Iced latte today because it is hot as hell and we are praying for days in the low 90s. That's when you know it's bad. What is that? I think it's like 33 degrees Celsius over there to y'all in Europe or something. I don't know. Anyways, got something for you today. Today is The Hive, or La Colmena in Español, by the Spanish, very Spanish author Camilo José Cela. First published in 1950, not in España, but actually in Argentina, for very ironic reasons that we'll discuss today. It's an interesting story. This is another beautiful edition by NYRB. I am partially sponsored by them in that they send me books for free, as they very kindly did with this one. And thank you very much to them. So, alright, let's get into it. Lots to discuss here. Cela was a controversial figure in Spain, and the winner of the 1989 Nobel Prize in Literature, in part for, I believe for his book La Familia de Pascal Duarte, The Family of Pascal Duarte, which the jury said was the most popular piece of Spanish fiction since Don Quixote by Cervantes, and which tells the violent life story of an imprisoned Spanish peasant. I think that's probably severely reducing it. I haven't read it yet, but I plan to. Sounds like something of a cross between Camus' The Stranger and Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which I did not enjoy. I enjoyed the former, not the latter. I can't wait to read it, actually. It looks great. And I might have started with that one first, had I known about it prior to reading this one. While he's criminally unknown in America, he is considered in his home country to be one of the greatest Spanish authors of the 20th century, and for damn good reason. He's unknown here, I think, just by nature of being so Spanish. His writing is all about Spain and Spaniards. It's very much of that country, of that territory, of that culture. So you have to have a real interest in that place to fully appreciate it, I think. He was many things throughout his life. He seemed to have kind of an adventurous life. At one point he was a bullfighter, then he was a film actor. He also sang tangos. I think that was just for fun. He even painted a bit. He was a bit of a Renaissance man, but also kind of a troll. An elegant provocateur, like a bullshitter, right? But a dignified bullshitter. He's also the rarest combination that I can think of, in something that modern audiences would probably think is a extinct or an oxymoron, which is a conservative poet. So let's talk about the Spanish Civil War, because that comes into play. As you probably already know, the Spanish Civil War began in 1936 and ended in 1939, which was the same year that World War II began. So us as Americans, we always think of, I think the general impression, our idea of World War II was that fascism was defeated by democracy in World War II. The Nazis were taken out, Hitler kills himself, Mussolini was nailed up by his ankles, done deal. That's basically the gist of it for us. That wasn't the case in Spain, right? Because the fascists won. The nationalists won. So Spain was under Franco's boot. It was under dictatorial control until 1975 when he died, and then it transitioned into democracy, where it is today. Spain's history was very different than the United States. Camilo José Cela was on the nationalist side, on the fascist side. He was fighting under Franco, right? And he maintained that allegiance, I think, all throughout his life. He joined up as a soldier and after the war worked as a censor. The irony is that when Cela published The Hive, it was censored in Spain. He had this whole battle with the censor and it had to be first published in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. So there's this whole contradiction at play here, right? Which never was resolved, really. It still doesn't really make any sense. Everybody's gonna say, well, how could you possibly have a guy who was a great author fighting on the side of the fascists in the Spanish Civil War? But there it is. But I will say he's a fine author, that much is clear. And not at all what you would expect from a guy on the side of Francisco Franco. That's for sure. It's a smart, creative, funny, irreverent, occasionally crass, empathetic, emotionally powerful novel. A portrait of many different types of people in a desperate time in history. It's a really tough time. And speaking of desperate times in history, today in America it's certainly not quite as bad as post-war Madrid in 1943, but give it some time, we'll see. And it is a really stressful time to be an adult out there in the world in America in 2024. All the news will tell you everything you need to know. I don't even need to go into detail. You know what I'm talking about because you're experiencing it. You're living through it right now. So we need tools for taking care of ourselves, for taking care of our mental health. Some of my favorites would be getting enough sleep, eating properly, exercise such as strength training or walking or incline walking. I love all of that. Walking is awesome. A lot of writers swear by walking. And another tool, would be therapy, which is why I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make finding therapy more affordable and accessible, which is helpful because finding a therapist could be potentially difficult given the slim options in your area, especially if you live somewhere rural and there's just not a lot of mental health services out there. Yeah, might be nice, might be really beautiful and good for walking, but yeah, it might be difficult to find a therapist who you fit with. But this is why BetterHelp is helpful, because you can go anywhere in the world, and as long as you have access to an internet connection, you have access to your therapist. And they make finding a therapist easy, thank God, unlike many things these days. Because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions online, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist in as little as just a few days. And it's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link below in the description. It's betterhelp.com/BTF. Clicking on that link helps support the show, but it also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, so you can try them out and see if it works for you. And I sincerely hope it does. And because finding the right therapist is a little bit like dating, as if you needed more challenges of that nature in your life, I know. But if you don't initially fit with your therapist, which is a common thing in therapy, you can switch to a new therapist at any time at no additional cost, without having to worry about health insurance or who's in your network or anything like that. No worries. So if you're struggling right now, and let's face it, who isn't? Please consider online therapy with BetterHelp. And thanks again to BetterHelp for supporting this channel. In essence, the Hive, as Cela says in one of the introductions included, as there are several in this edition, and they're actually terrific to read. You should do it after you read the book, though, in my opinion. But he says in one of them that the Hive is, in essence, a slice of life, a fragment of life, as he puts it. And I think that's the perfect description of the book. It's really just a few days, a slice of life, in a certain place, in a certain time, with a whole host of characters that make up this composite portrait of a city, of a culture. This novel of mine has no aspirations to be anything more than, and certainly nothing less than, a fragment of life, told step by step, without any reticence, without any unlikely tragedies, without any charity, but just as life itself flows by, exactly as life flows by, whether we want it to or not. Life is what is lived through, by us or within us. We are no more than life's vehicle, what an apothecary would call its excipient. I think that nowadays it is impossible to transform life into fiction, for better or for worse, any further than I have done so here. If I thought otherwise, I would give up being a writer. Yeah, he's definitely got this kind of bravado and showmanship, this kind of confidence, whether real or manufactured. It's hard to tell sometimes. The first thing this novel reminded me of was the French author Georges Perec's Life a User's Manual, which from memory, it's been years since I've read it, so I don't remember any of it, but I believe it has a kind of bird's eye view of various Parisian lives converging with the plot surrounding a single character. Kind of like I think puzzle pieces are a motif in the book. The Hive is more of a portrait of just that. A hive, a city, a culture, a community that is post-war Madrid in the winter of 1943. There are recurring characters and narratives that play out as the novel progresses, but there isn't a main character, not really. Aside from perhaps the tragic ill-fated fellow down on his luck Martin Marco, whom the book ends on. Like Cela, Marco is a writer and recently published something that might get him in trouble. The story definitely captures the darkness of the times, under the boot of a dictatorship that the author ironically helped facilitate. I don't know how to reconcile these things. But also the endurance of a culture making do with what they have, persevering, though their fate, like Martin Marco, is uncertain. I don't think I've read a novel quite like this, with no protagonist, but rather a series of mini-protagonists, right? All operating in the same realm and bumping into one another. It's like being God, kind of like watching mankind go about their day, seeing all the funny, troubled situations that your creation gets into. Like, oh boy, there you go, what are you doing? The book is told in a string of vignettes, these little snippets, these little vignettes, hundreds of them, wherein characters are introduced and their thoughts are revealed. I don't know how many characters there are. Cela said 160 in one of the introductions, but I've seen it written that there are over 300. I'm really not sure about that. For a book of only 250 pages or so, this is really something, no? I don't even know if there were that many characters in Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. I mean, how many characters are there in Gravity's Rainbow? How many? Yeah, 400. Pynchon beat him, but I mean, Gravity's Rainbow is much, much longer, so. But as far as these characters, I mean, there's some very memorable ones, these madrileños, people who live in Madrid. There's the outrageous cafe owner, Doña Rosa, with her outbursts and her abuse of the waitstaff. She's rooting for the Germans as they're losing the war, and it worries her at night. She's a terrible person. Everybody hates her, but she's very entertaining. A lot of the goings-on in the story revolve around her cafe, and they drink white coffee there, which I don't know what that is. It's very interesting. What's white coffee? Oh, I think it's also called a leche manchada, which is stained, like stained milk. Yeah, so it's mostly milk with a little bit of coffee. Interesting. That sounds terrible. Doña Rosa's face is covered in patches of dry skin. It's like she's a lizard, always shedding. When she's thinking about something, she absentmindedly pulls strips of skin from her face, sometimes as long as party streamers. Then she pulls herself together and patrols the cafe once again, up and down, smiling at her customers, whom she secretly hates, with their little blackened teeth covered in filth. Cela has gotten in trouble for saying some borderline homophobic stuff, but ironically the book kind of reminds me of a film by Pedro Almodovar, like all the various characters, you know, and their stories, their dramas. There's Celestino Ortiz, a bartender who's who loves and memorizes the book Daybreak by Nietzsche and hides it when the police come in. There's a girl named Victorita who has to choose between remaining pure and selling her body in order to help her boyfriend who has tuberculosis, which Cela himself had at one point. Among the characters are men and women broke, down on their luck. There's a poet, there's gay men, there's a good marriage, there's a bad marriage, and then there's a murder mystery and a suicide and much more. And then there's a very sad portrait of a very young gypsy boy, which was probably one of the most moving bits in the entire book. He was only 6 years old, and is being forced to live like an adult in this post-war landscape, and it is just like, dude, that's heavy shit. Like, he's just out there working every day, you know, and after he's done, he goes into the cafe and orders from the waitress, orders his dinner from the waitress, and it's just a very brutal depiction of life. I mean, that must have happened, right? You know, in post-war Europe, totally. I could totally see that happening. And he embellishes things, I think, but I don't know if that's all that embellished. I mean, and if it isn't, that's really, really tough, man. It's just hard. It's just really hard time, really hard place to be and exist. Cela is a wonderful personality. There are very few authors that I think I would have wanted to, he has since passed away, rest in peace, very few authors who I would have wanted to have a drink with or dinner with or something, you know, smoke a cigar with, and filmmakers too. But he's definitely one of them. He has this sort of, it's almost similar to the personality of somebody like Orson Welles, right? He's got this big baritone brass voice, you know, very charismatic, very confident, very well spoken, dresses in his suits, smokes a cigarette in a very calm and contemplative manner, is always on point with what he says, and is very arrogant, which he said, like, somebody calling him arrogant is like calling somebody a blonde or a brunette or something. I'm paraphrasing. It's like, it's so obvious, it's ridiculous to even say. And the polar opposite of David Foster Wallace, for example. Just something like that, you know? Like somebody so confident and sarcastic and ironic in their humor, but it's perfect. It's like this very funny, like an irreverent patriarch, like the boss man who's always kindly giving you shit, you know? It's something missing in today's culture, I don't know. It's a very masculine persona. He's a very funny guy. He's very charismatic, very, very off the cuff and like, boo, like, fuck you, you know? And if I may say so, very Spanish. There's something about this kind of power, and not only the humor, but also like the power, like the force of personality, right? I feel there is a very particular style of Spanish humor that is dignified but also base. He was also part English, so I think he's discussed his style and his humor in relation to English humor as well. That could be part of it. I don't know. I certainly get it. I think it's fantastic. I think he's hysterical. Yeah, he's like a cross between like John Cleese and Orson Welles, but Spanish, right? Something like that. And a great writer. A great writer. You have to watch some interviews, read some anecdotes, find some clips, and then suddenly it dawns on you. This guy was a literary genius and a comedian. He was also a good friend of Pablo Picasso. There's some great photos of them together. He shows off a lighter Picasso gave him in the entrevista below, near the end. So born and raised in Galicia, with a marvelous childhood, apparently, by his own words. Dorado, as he put it, like golden childhood. He published a book when he was 26 that had a tremendous impact on Spain in the 40s, entitled The Family of Pascal Duarte. His literary style, in fact, has been dubbed tremendismo, which by definition on Britannica is a narrative style that has a tendency to emphasize violence and grotesque imagery. The Hive didn't strike me as excessively violent or grotesque, only occasionally, and mostly towards the end, if I remember correctly. Maybe the family of Pascal Duarte was more in that vein, I'm not sure. So yeah, Cela was a conservative and after the war operated as a spy for the regime, giving information on other intellectuals of the era, I think turning them in. And I think this was voluntary. I don't think anybody asked him to do this. It's suspected in the article that he might have been currying favor to the government. Who knows? So he was serious. He was loyal to the nationalists, but he was also irreverent and kind of a joker, and a great storyteller. An uncommon combination, but then everything about him is uncommon. Not a combination I've seen, in fact, at all, save for perhaps Louis Ferdinand Céline, who he's been compared to, but they're absolutely not the same, in my opinion. You know, in the impression I have of them, you know, Cela is far warmer, far more charismatic as a human being, not nearly as poisonous. Céline is like a reptile. Céline does have a warm side, but it's sort of like a dying ember at the pit of a dead volcano in Antarctica. You know what I mean? So in addition to being a renowned Spanish literary titan, he also wrote an entire Spanish dictionary of obscenities, like bad words. He was a complicated figure. He was a funny guy. I admire his candor, even if he was occasionally full of shit, or often full of shit. You'll see what I mean if you dive deeper. At first he seems kind of like respectable, well-to-do, honorable, forthright, honest. That's the image he wants to put forth. But then he'll just, with no warning, write or say some stuff which will totally throw you off, and you'll just be like, is he taking the piss? And yes, he is. Taking the piss is a wonderful British phrase. But then that's kind of what he was all about, as you can see in this interview below on the legendary El Fondo, the polyhedric nature of mankind, right? The multiple faces we all wear. Not one flat plane of linear nature in a character, in a person, but rather multiple planes to a single shape, right? Multiple sides to a single person. Julita feels a little strange. Sometimes she senses a burden on top of her. At others she has to make a great effort not to smile. The human brain, she thinks, is a very imperfect machine. If you could only read what was going on in people's heads, like reading a book. No, it's better that everything carries on as is. Better for us not to be able to read anything. Better that we only understand one another via what we choose to say. Fuck it, even if it's only lies. From time to time, Julita, when she is alone, likes to use bad language. Cela very much seems like a character who often tells the truth but is not to be trusted. Not in entirety, at least. I think he's sincere most of the time, but sometimes he's not. I don't trust Camilo José Cela when he speaks about himself at all, yet I instinctively trust him when he talks or writes about everything else. Isn't that weird? He's a marvelous commentator on life and people in the act of living. An eyewitness to a fascinating period in history in a very specific place and culture. For an American, you know, this book is kind of obscure, but it was, and I didn't really know what it was going to be like going in. I just dove in. I liked the sound of it. I liked the description. I liked the cover. I really didn't know what to expect. This is my first time reading Cela, and I'd never heard of him prior to just reading a description of this book online. And so I just jumped in, and it was surprisingly relatable. I mean, it really, you know, even if you're not from Spain or didn't grow up in Spain. And it made me laugh and occasionally brought me pretty close to tears. This is actually about somebody's talking parrot. Rabelais is his name. Goodness, what on earth is that? Oh, don't get me started. It's a parrot, the very devil. But it's scandalous. It shouldn't be allowed. You're not wrong. I don't know what to do about it. Rabelais is a very dangerous parrot, a shameless and unprincipled parrot, an ungrateful parrot that no one can get back onto the straight and narrow. Sometimes he goes through phases where he is a bit calmer, saying chocolate and Portugal and other words that are suitable for a slightly posher parrot, but he's thoughtless, and then, when you least expect it, most likely when his owner has an important visitor around, he lets himself go, and swears and blasphemes in his broken old spinster's voice. Angelito, a very pious boy who lives in the neighborhood, was trying to lead Rabelais back onto the paths of righteousness, but got nowhere. His efforts were all in vain, and all his travails were for naught. He became disheartened and tried less and less often, and Rabelais, with no one to offer him moral guidance, spent a fortnight using language that would make a sailor blush. Rabelais the parrot is one of the most memorable characters in the book. It's an experimental novel, but it's one that feels very natural as an experience, which is probably a testament to its ingenuity. You know, it's something that feels quite modern. It's not at all shocking in its form and structure to us. I think we've read enough things like it these days that it's going to feel quite natural to engage with it, you know, for modern audiences, modern Western audiences. Cela really loved Spain. He loved his country. He liked to travel around it by foot, actually. And he wrote about it in at least one book, I believe. He wrote like a travel book. He knew the country very well and was proud of that. And there is that kind of wandering quality to the narrative, interestingly enough. The process of discovery and the description of a time and place, little by little, building on itself, you know? Everything slowly coming into view. Before starting this, I thought, I don't know Madrid. I've been there. I love it, but I'm not sure I'll get everything about this book. And I'm sure there's stuff I'm not getting in here. But what I mean to say is I find it very accessible for someone who isn't Spanish. It really is a novel of society, and societies are not so different that you won't recognize archetypes or things similar to your own, especially in Western society. One thing I found remarkable, given Spain's perhaps notorious reputation for machismo men, was Cela's sympathetic depictions of women, often from the lower classes. I mean, the story of Dorrita near the end just destroyed me. And it was out of the blue, and there was hardly anything as jagged in the novel up until that point. Just emotionally gutting, right? Just gutting. It just goes through her whole life and how she came to be where she is now, and just awful, awful. I come away from the book thinking really it's women who are holding up society. You know what I mean? Who form the backbone, he seems to suggest. He treats them with dignity just as much as the male characters, and they're fleshed out to a degree that is believable and often tragic. Though I gotta say, all the personalities are somewhat thin. You only get a little bit of each as we kind of jump around from vignette to vignette. Cela seemed to have a knack for overhearing dialogue. The El País journalist Juan Cruz noted his skill for listening, which is interesting because, Cela was also turning people in, so it was sort of like he was using this skill for good and bad, right? Certainly the book reads like a bunch of overheard conversations, as if you were a ghost drifting into rooms and out of doorways and into the street and into people's heads, able to access their emotions and see their past, right? It's really forward moving in the literary world. You can see why it was a big deal. It's very funny and approachable and also very thought-provoking, as well as occasionally painful and dark as hell, particularly towards the end. Things become increasingly emotionally heavy, I noticed. The ending was beautiful, I thought. This quietly tragic moment with this sense of impending doom, but I don't want to spoil it. Better than food. So you should read it. Well, it's been compared to the work of John Dos Passos and Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, neither of which I've read, but if you enjoyed either of those and you liked George Perec's Life a User's Manual, and the kind of like the multi-character nature of something like Gravity's Rainbow, I imagine this is probably up your alley. And yeah, it did kind of have the same sensibility and humor as Don Quixote, I felt. And also a book that's kind of told in humorous vignettes. Perhaps Cela was inspired a little bit by Cervantes, but I'm not entirely sure. Seems hard to believe that he wouldn't be in some way. Coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take all the names of the patrons on Patreon supporting the show financially, and I place them in this mason jar. And for every review, I pull out a name. And whoever's name I pull out is sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. The coffee is delicious. Currently from Nicaragua. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. You can go to patreon.com/books are better than food, or click on the link below and donate whatever you can afford. The tiers start at $5 per video. But you can cap your monthly expenses so you don't go over budget, and you'll still get access to all the content. You'll also get access to all these reviews ad-free, the Patron-Only Reviews, the Discord channel, and you'll get access to the Sexual Personae series, wherein I'm posting Patron-Only reviews covering every chapter of Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae, with supplementary live streams. It's a good time. And finally, the Better Than Friday newsletter, which is just a list of 5 different things I'm interested in at any given time. Could be books in the pipeline, music, films, changes week to week, and I just post that for patrons every Friday. If you think we have similar taste and you're looking for new stuff of that variety, I think you'll enjoy that. And international shipping is included. All right. Good? Good. Okay. Thank you very much to all my patrons for helping keep this whole machine going. Hope you're doing well, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. Oh. Eugene C. Thank you very much, Eugene. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive The Hive by Camilo José Cela, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And hope you love both. Cheers. Please subscribe if you have not already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember, die reading. All right, take care of yourselves. Have a good night. Talk to you soon. Ciao.